Right. Hi, everyone. Should we get started?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Okay. Paul, I saw you added 2 items to the agenda. You're probably looking for feedback on those 2 PRs, I'm guessing.
Yeah, that's exactly what I hope to get by adding them to the agenda. I don't necessarily think that we need to discuss them here. I was just going to ask for folks to please read those PRs and comment on them. I'm not sure it's worth discussing either of them unless people have already done that and have some opinions they want to share. But I'm also happy to give a treatment of them for folks that may be watching a recording.
No, from my perspective, I'll make sure I follow up with Jonathan concerning the cluster credentials API, because he's had more background and has done more work around that area for us. And I'll say I'll commit to a review before the end of this week.
Okay, that would be great. I suspect the item about the charter is like basically just a matter of folks reading the pull request, which admittedly I updated the wrong branch and only realized that I hadn't updated the correct one earlier today. So if you took a look and were like, why is this on the agenda when it hasn't been updated in a month? That's why, and it is now updated.
Okay.
Morning, everyone. Irfan just messaged me to say that he is running late. So if someone else could run the meeting. Paul, I don't know if you want to do that. Shashi?
Sorry, Zoom just crashed for me, and I was just able to rejoin right now.
Yeah, the only thing that's any discussion.
Sorry, you broke up, Christian. What was that?
Oh, I was just telling Paul that he didn't miss any discussion.
Oh, okay.
No.
Yeah, I don't know if you got that, Paul, but Irfan, who usually runs the meetings, is running late and asked if somebody could step in and fill in for him. Any volunteers?
Yeah, we had already started the meeting,
okay.
and we're just discussing the 2 outstanding pull requests, both the SIG Charter PR and the Cluster Connection API, which relates to cluster registry, to which, at least in the latter, we, myself and Jonathan, who's not here now, will commit to reviewing by the end of this week.
I'm happy to give a treatment of either of these items if we think it would be helpful, you know, for folks that might be watching on recording. Do we want to go ahead and do that quick?
It sounds useful to me.
Okay, so let's start with the cluster. I'm sorry, with the SIG charter. I will drop a link into the chat. One moment. Okay, so I've dropped a link into the chat. Basically, this is a copy of the newer SIG charter template, which I have added very basic treatment, tried to be really specific about the scope of the SIG. Since that was there was feedback earlier on this pull request that said that additional specificity was desired. Essentially what I did is define the scope in terms of the existing sub-projects that are nominally attached to the SIG. And in doing so, tried to avoid like vague statements about the wider problem space. I felt that was the best way to be really specific for now. And if we decide to alter the scope of the SIG in the future, we can update the charter as needed.
Okay, that sounds really non-controversial.
Yeah. Any comments or anything before we move on to the cluster credentials pull request to the cluster registry?
No, maybe the only thing I'd ask is, do we want to say anything specific in the charter about Federation V1 with respect to the fact that it's now pretty much orphaned in favor of V2?
I am not remembering what I said already in the charter about that, so I will have to go and look at my own pull request.
I don't think that belongs in the charter. I think we should document it clearly somewhere, but I don't think the charter is the right place to put that personally.
I just said that it was in scope for the SIG, and I made no statement about V2 and V1 and their relationship.
That seems appropriate to me.
Okay.
We do repeatedly get that question, I must say, and we do need to deal with it properly. I got another personal request for clarifying why we stopped V1 and all that kind of stuff, which I can reply to. But yeah, I'll take an action item to put a definitive answer to that question.
I was thinking more specifically about whether we want to list it as a sub-project, given that the charter is a live document.
Well, Federation is a sub-project, right? And it has different versions. That was the way I was thinking about it.
Right now, the way that the scope reads is there's two links, one for V2, one for V1. So I guess my simplest proposal would be to unlink V1.
Oh, I see. Sorry, I didn't notice that aspect to it. Yeah, if we're going to have V1 and V2 listed there, we definitely need to clarify which one is supported and which one is not. Yeah, or remove the versions, which is what I thought Paul said he'd done, but it doesn't look like that's the current state of the document.
I just gave them both bullets, and I made no statement about how they are related to one another.
Oh, I see. Okay, I'll put some comments in the PR as to what I think we might be able to do about that.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. Anything else, or should we move on to cluster credentials?
There's one comment.
Before we do that, so Paul, just to clarify, so do we think we're pretty much done with the other than these small nits? Are we ready to merge, or?
I'm here and ship it.
Were all the comments that were added to the PR addressed?
I was kind of joking, Quentin. I'm not sure if you were on when I said this, but I had updated the pull request, or I'd gone and made changes to address the comments, and then pinged people, tagged them in a GitHub comment saying, "Hey, take a look," but I pushed to the wrong branch. So I think there is still like I'd like Aaron and Tim St. Clair to re-review now that I've actually pushed the changes to the right branch, which I did earlier today. So modulo that, I would say that I suspect that we're close to being able to merge it.
Okay, awesome.
There's one open comment from Aaron about which SIG would own the reconciliation between API and registry. Is there an answer to that, or is that just an unknown question?
So I felt as though I had addressed that by very clearly defining the scope. Honestly, John, I'm not sure if there's a way to directly address that comment without it being like really overly specific. But I'd be certainly open to suggestions if you had one.
Okay, I just didn't know whether that was still an open question or if that had been like decided but outside the scope of this PR or something like that.
Yeah, and as I was taking a look at that earlier today, I realized that I should probably put at least a response to Aaron's comment, which I will do now.
Great, thank you.
I mean, that, with respect to his question, that's come to my ear as well. There's some confusion between cluster API and cluster registry, which implicitly is also an API. Depending on what your exposure is in Kubernetes, some people have only heard about cluster API, and others, including people in Istio, only know about the cluster registry API. So I understand the source of the confusion, but like you said, I don't know how to directly address it without being overly specific and cross-referencing other SIG.
I would, what I'm thinking of in my head is something to the effect of, you know, that of another area of the community that wants to use one of these components in terms of, for example, writing to the cluster registry API. That should be within the scope of that part of the community. And in the event that, you know, another part of the community wants there to be changes in the cluster registry API or another piece of software that's in the scope of the SIG, that jointly we should work through it.
Okay, yeah.
It sounds like we might, as a SIG, need like an FAQ page or something where we can refer people to for questions that get asked regularly. This one seems to have come up more than once. What's the difference between the two, and where do I go if I want to find out about cluster API versus cluster registry? That seems like a reasonable candidate to include in an FAQ. The other one that comes up is what's with the V1 and V2 stuff of federation. So we can add that. So okay, let's add an FAQ. I can kickstart that.
Okay, and as an action item, I will add some verbiage around the topic of the question that that Aaron has asked vis-a-vis other parts of the community that want to use pieces of software in the scope of the SIG. Okay, should we take a look at or give some treatment to the cluster credentials poll if we're talked through with the charter?
Sure, go ahead.
All right, let me put a link in the chat. One moment. So I've put a link to the pull request in the chat. During a prior discussion about elevating the cluster registry API to beta, I had an action item that came out of that to add an API resource that paired an entry in the cluster registry with a set of credentials that could be used to access that cluster. the pull request that is in there now just contains the API definition. It doesn't contain the controller that would back it. So essentially the TLDR of the new API resource is that its spec is essentially a reference to a cluster in the cluster registry and a reference to a secret that contains a kubeconfig that can be used to configure a REST client to access the cluster. It has a status that indicates whether those credentials can successfully be used to hit the referenced cluster's health-z endpoint from the location that the controller is run. And now I will stop talking and just solicit any comments that people may have around this.
Yeah, I took a look at it. It looked pretty sane to me. I think Maru made some feedback around the degree that we want to follow the conditions stuff and whether we want to do it differently. But other than that, I think it looks fine.
Yeah, I haven't yet made any changes around conditions. I was hoping before I invested too much additional effort in this that we could get some group consensus about whether we think this is the right general API to have. And if we think so, then we can hone down the details about what the format of status should be, for example.
Yeah, I think the level of detail is about right, and I think the structure is about right. And I don't feel too strongly about the conditions versus alternatives to using conditions part of it.
So do you anticipate, so what I'm reading in cluster credentials spec, there's a local object reference for secret, which contains a kubeconfig. Now, what I'm trying to determine here is this is associated to a cluster registry entry, which seems like you may want to have a public-facing view of that cluster registry entry, but whatever secret associated to it, you probably want to keep private. Is there not a case for making putting one in one namespace and another in another namespace?
So in prior art in the Kubernetes community, a reference to a secret is not considered to be escalating. So for example, like the fact that secrets exist in a namespace does not inherently make the namespace itself escalating. And resources that contain references to secrets by name and even to their keys, for example, like anything with a pod spec can do that. Those aren't considered to be inherently escalating. We also don't have a rich practice of cross namespace APIs. So without a use case that we can point to store the secret in another namespace, which honestly I think would just introduce even more security complications rather than diminish them. It seems conventional to me as someone that's built a number of APIs in Kubernetes that have this kind of secret reference in them that it should be okay. But that's my own subjective opinion.
Okay, I think I remember looking at this a while back, and there were quite a few that I can find which were object references that at least allowed different namespace to be specified. Now, I don't know if that was done for an explicit purpose or if what you're saying basically points at what you think is an anti-pattern. but I'd have to spend a bit of time backing up what I'm trying to advance here.
Yeah, honestly, I think that one element that has some similarity to this that I can point to elsewhere in the Kubernetes community is not crossing namespaces, but crossing from a cluster scope to a namespace scope. And the case I can point to there is that we had a cluster scope set of API resources and service catalog. One of those is something called a cluster service broker, which basically represents some REST endpoint that like the controller backing this API should talk to. And in order to use authentication with that API, we had to make a reference from the cluster scope to a secret in a namespace. And one complication that this introduced is that we had to ensure that there was a subject access review performed as part of admission on this resource that verified that the person creating the cluster scope resource and naming the making a reference to a secret in a namespace had write permission on the secret resource in that namespace to avoid a situation where somebody could steal the secret information by creating a cluster scoped or this cluster service broker resource, naming a secret that they didn't have access to, and using that to point to an endpoint that they controlled and steal the secret that way. So in general, my preference would be to avoid introducing complications like that. I don't think that is necessarily wholly diminished by making the reference local to the namespace, but it avoids potential misuse via specification of a secret in another namespace that you don't control.
I think I share Christian's general concern, but I just want to clarify something. So the way the API proposal is structured right now, there's essentially a cluster credential which has a reference to a cluster and a reference to a secret. And I assume the intention is that there would be many of these referring to the same cluster. So
accurate.
A given cluster would potentially have a different cluster credential per user or per namespace, or and that any given user may not have access to more than some number of those. And the way you would use this is you would list the clusters, and then you would go and find all the cluster credentials that you have access to, either in your namespace or across multiple namespaces or whatever. But the fact that you have read access to them, and then those tell you where to go and find the secrets, either in the same namespace as the cluster credential or in a different namespace, which I think was Christian's potential suggestion. But either way, it is possible to have read access to a cluster registry and see that there are clusters that either not have any credentials to them or only see the ones that you're allowed to have access to. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say that's roughly accurate, with the qualification that Kubernetes APIs don't have ACL filter list watch, so we can't constrain a collection of resources by the permission of the person trying to view them. If you have get permission, if you have list permission, you've got it. Or rather, if you have list permission, you have read permission over the entire collection. So modulo that one fairly minor nit that probably is more representative of my storied history in my own mind, debating the merits of ACL filter list watch than anything else. I think you're right.
Okay, so I think that might address what I understood Christian's concern to be, which was that was it possible to permission the secret and the cluster credential appropriately so that the right people had access to them?
It's very possible to set permissions up so that so that actors that should be able to see only the clusters can only see the clusters, that should be able to see only. I think I just flashed back to my youth. To finish my thought, it's very possible to set up RBAC permissions, for example, so that so that a user can only access which clusters are in the cluster registry in a certain namespace. They may only be able to access the clusters and cluster credentials, but not access the secrets themselves. I think that's what you were asking about, Quentin.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of what you're saying is implicit in the API. Part of this is not your fault for the reasons you explained. The free form, kind of kube config, and the fact that the kube config format has not been elevated to an API outside of kubectl, to my knowledge, makes it a little bit unfortunate. But yeah, in terms of if I was going to use this, I would clearly have a different actor or persona associated to the cluster reference itself, and a different set of, that would be the admin, I guess, or the user or the controller, and the secret reference would probably be just the controller and the admin, not necessarily the user of that cluster reference. So in order to kind of, I guess, express this, there's a fair amount of RBAC roles that need to be at least bound.
Yeah, and I am not sure whether the cluster registry currently includes any definitions of roles that are installed in the cluster. I'm inclined to say it doesn't, but I just have a normal human brain, so I might be wrong.
Sorry, I got disturbed there. Christian, just to clarify, are you concerned that a given user may not be able to distinguish between different credentials that may be necessary to perform different roles, or was it more than that?
No, I guess I'm concerned with the fact that I don't think this cluster credential spec is usable in a production environment unless it is paired with a fairly elaborate RBAC specification.
Okay, so that part I didn't understand, and maybe that I misunderstand this, but the way I understand this could be used is the cluster registry has a list of clusters. The clusters are all readable by everyone, presumably, or approximately. That would be a reasonable use. And then there are credentials, many of them, all of which refer to the same cluster. And each one of those cluster credentials is RBAC'd to the people who have access to it. And if the secret that is referred to by the cluster credential is in the same namespace with the same credentials, then you're good. So in my namespace, I have a cluster credential, which refers to a cluster in the registry, and a secret in my namespace, and that's what I use. And I'm the only one who has access, or whoever has access to my namespace has access to those credentials. Would be the canonical use case I'm thinking of. So am I missing something, or are you worried about something different?
Yeah, I guess the So if you look at the kubeconfig format, there are per user fields in there. And, you know, I guess, do you anticipate if you have multiple users in one namespace, how would you express this in cluster credentials spec? Would you have many cluster objects? Or many?
You would have many cluster credentials. So I think Christian, the element of this that is the concern is that there are a lot of things that the kubeconfig could contain, and as defined at this point, it's rather loosey-goosey what's actually expected by this API to be in that config file. Is that along the lines of what's in your head?
Right, and this is the part where I can't blame you because of how loosey-goosey kubeconfig has been, you know, spec'd.
Do we have a use case for this? Like, I get that this could be theoretically useful, but who's actually asking for this?
For what are you talking about, Maru?
Being able to have multiple clusters, well, authentication credentials for multiple clusters, sorry, multiple credentials for a single cluster. Like, what's the use case for that? Not theoretical, but who actually is asking for this? Why do they need it?
I'm not sure that Christian was saying that he felt that was a goal. I think it was actually the opposite, that the way that I understood you, Christian, was that your reservations were that there are basically arbitrary things that could be contained in a kubeconfig file, and the API as defined is basically a reference to an opaque file that we don't have an API for.
Right. So let me try to be more specific and see if this applies. If I have a cluster, it's in a specific namespace, and I have two users. You can conceivably have a kubeconfig where one user has an access token and another user has their own access token. Now, are we going to have those two users use the same access token for the single cluster in the same namespace?
Yeah, you're asking about what affinity these secrets that contain kube configs will have with one or more cluster credentials, right?
Yes, and multi-user setting was just an example. The breadth of specs that are in kubeconfig are probably more. This is just the one that comes to mind.
Yeah, and let me ask this by way of doing some discovery. Would you be more comfortable with this API if instead of an opaque reference to a kubeconfig, there were strongly typed or at least explicitly recorded fine-grained expectations about like smaller pieces of information than a whole kubeconfig file that should be in specific keys of the secret, perhaps?
I know I would, because it would, like, this would answer a lot of the to-dos, right? What's left is open right now. Like, explain required kubeconfig fields.
Yes. Yep.
Which are required, which are not required. So you're looking at API, which is not strongly typed, and the behavior of the API effectively depends on an opaque JSON blob.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I had similar reservations, but this is the kind of feedback I was hoping to get from a group discussion. So it would be great if you could comment on that, and perhaps I can spend some time thinking about like what the minimum usable amount of information would be that could encapsulate all the different, mechanisms that might be specified inside of kubeconfig.
Question from a relative new guy. Is there a set of either like specs or requirements that this pull request is kind of a implementation solution for? Has that been documented, like what exactly problems this is trying to solve?
That's a good question.
I think the motivator, John, and that's a really good question, is that as part of the discussion around should we take the cluster registry as it is today and elevate it to beta, there was a feeling in the group that it seemed quite odd to do that when there is not a way to, for example, specify how you might actually access one of the clusters in the cluster registry. That is at a very high level, like qualitatively, what I would frame as the story for where this comes from, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I can maybe add a bit of color there. The origin was actually discussion primarily between myself and Jonathan in this meeting approximately a month ago. And he wanted to promote cluster registry to beta, but he made the observation that we didn't actually have any users yet of cluster registry. And that made it very difficult to validate whether or not the API was sufficient. So I made the observation that the federation system used the cluster registry, but had to build essentially a parallel cluster registry to contain the credentials, because otherwise we couldn't use the cluster registry, and made the observation that once you do that, you don't really need the cluster registry because you have to have another registry of credentials, essentially. And that may explain why nobody was using the cluster registry. So on the back of that, we decided that making the cluster registry usable without having to add additional stuff to it, specifically these credentials, seemed to be a prerequisite to get people to use it, which is a prerequisite to get it to beta. So that was the full story behind the origin of this.
Okay, thanks. Just from looking at the pull request without really the context of what set of problems this is trying to solve, since auth and credentials is kind of, as you mentioned, kind of a large lobby space of lots of different options. It's hard to me to evaluate if this solves, since I don't know exactly what set of problems it's trying to solve, whether it does that well or not.
Yeah, that's a very good feedback. So if we did our job, we would have documented and noted what I just mentioned in the meeting notes from a few weeks ago, in which case we should cut and paste those in. So here it is. If you scroll down in the meeting notes to the 28th of 28th of the 8th, you will see the last item in the meeting notes about moving cluster registry to beta. And the whole discussion is there.
Okay, so basically that this pull request is kind of the response to that discussion there from the 28th.
Correct.
Awesome.
And
Thank you.
I'm going to suggest to Paul that he just cut and paste that piece of those notes as motivation for the PR. Does that make sense?
So is it fair to say, if you have no background with Federation, I think the goal here is to reconstruct a functional kube client using essentially state that is already stored in Kubernetes objects?
Okay, so just for clarification, is the idea that the secret credentials be mostly, we're talking about tokens or client certs or something like that? Like if you have a cluster that relies on OAuth or some other webhook based mechanism, would this cluster credentials be relevant in that scenario? Or is the idea that this actually stores a reference to the actual secret that has a token or client cert or something like that you would use to authenticate?
Yeah, my understanding is that's still open-ended. I don't know, like for example, for Federation 2, what is the minimum viable requirement that be stored in the kube config?
I don't think we have a good handle on exactly what the minimum is. I think that depends on probably like what type of authentication mechanisms we would want to use, but I am not actually an expert yet on the kube config format itself. Overall, I would say that I would want to be able to use an arbitrary supported method of authentication that I can specify in a kube config in order to, and whatever else attendant with that, I need to construct a usable REST client that I can use to access the cluster's API.
But the goal of the exercise anything more than to be able to produce a REST client for this API?
Yeah, it's to produce a REST client that it can be used to, well, it's to produce a REST client and use that REST client to, one, hit the cluster's health Z endpoint so that the status of this resource can reflect, yes, this cluster is actually reachable from where I'm running the controller. And then for other APIs to use cluster credentials as the sort of lingua franca of how I can make a connection to a cluster that's off cluster relative to me.
Okay, so I would just say from the outside perspective, since there are so many ways that one can authenticate with a cluster using various mechanisms, it would make like knowing what subset of those are intended to be covered by this mechanism would be useful. Like if it's supposed to be like comprehensive, no matter what form of auth you're using, you could represent that using a cluster credential. I think in my opinion, it's a little like vague and undefined, just like a secret. But if it's supposed to be more narrowly for a subset of those, and we'll see like a different mechanism if using like the AWS authenticating webhook that Heptio created or something like that, like that would use a different mechanism to represent that off. I think it'd be good to clarify that in the scope of this.
Could you leave a comment to that effect, John?
Certainly.
All right, thank you.
Just to clarify my understanding, so right now, the vast majority of interactions with Kubernetes clusters is done via kubeconfig. Kubecontrol. That's a question, and kubecontrol uses a kubeconfig to get the information and then executes an authentication against those clusters in order to interact with them. Are those two statements approximately true?
Yes. I think where it gets a little complicated is the mechanism for authentication varies wildly, both client side and server side. So client side, you may have the use of static tokens, which in turn are on the server would be Kubernetes service accounts. Assuming
but all the detail of that is encapsulated in one tool called kubecontrol and one configuration for kubecontrol, which is kubeconfig. And so I'm sure there are things that it cannot do. I'm sure you could make a cluster which kubeconfig with an appropriate kubecontrol was not capable of authenticating against. But the vast majority of authentication is executed by kubecontrol using kubeconfig. And I think the scope of this PR is to cover those use cases. So if you could get to a cluster with a kubeconfig and kubecontrol, then you can put that kubeconfig in this cluster registry, and then something that does exactly the same thing as kubecontrol would be equally capable of authenticating against that cluster.
Well, in that case, what if I asked you if one of the configurations of the kubeconfig forces the client to run a client-side command to refresh tokens? Is your controller going to do the same thing? Especially if that command is a binary that's stored alongside kubecontrol?
I'm not a kubecontrol or kubeconfig expert, but I would assume that the common client code that is used that reads kubeconfig, if it is able to do such a thing, then I guess in a cluster it could do the same. In a federation control plane, it could in theory do the same thing. Who put that binary there and all those details, and whether that's secure is a different field. But in theory, the kubeconfig that is contained in the secret could provide the same information that it provides to kubecontrol. And the federation control plane or any other consumer of the cluster registry and these credentials could do exactly what kubecontrol does. Sorry, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Paul, but I think that's your intention, right?
I would say that that if there's intention, it's to avoid having, for example, to take on the like considerable effort of defining and enumerating all of the various mechanisms that you can put into a kubeconfig when the people that are maintaining the format itself have not done so already in terms of an API. There's also the desire to avoid, I would say, even if we knew all those things and had an API for it, I would probably still make this API point to a secret that held an API resource that could be deserialized and, you know, go through a validation path, etc., rather than having first-class fields for different pieces of what you can do in a kubeconfig that were directly part of this resource, because that would make this resource escalating. Meaning that if you had view access to this resource, you could, you know, reconstruct a kubeconfig with the same information, and basically steal information that should be secret. It's not desirable to add new escalating resources, and very desirable to ensure that information that's secret lives in Kubernetes secrets. So this may be a question ultimately of being very specific and possibly adding validation on the controller side about what can be in the kubeconfig that's referenced here. But I do not think that that putting this information into first-class fields in this API is the right play to make, personally.
Yeah, I think you're right. I haven't heard the request for that, for I think all the reasons you enumerate. However, kubeconfig is too freeform, and I think you have to be much more prescriptive in what you actually support. So if I cast this back to Federation, V1, or what I remember from it, I mean, the actual store there was an access token for a Kubernetes service account. Now, that is something that can be easily supported, at least until Kubernetes introduces expiry time for access tokens, which becomes like more complicated. But if something like what I was mentioning before about something in kubeconfig requires client side reevaluation and a dependency on an external binary, that's a little bit problematic. Now, maybe this can be turned into a webhook and more and more complicated, but on the surface, I would try to narrow and be much more prescriptive in what this supports for now, rather than just relying on kubeconfig.
Yeah, I think that what I'm hearing is that additional specificity with potentially servers, like controller validation of the targeted kubeconfig, so that we can be very, very specific about exactly which auth methods, et cetera, are supported is desired, right?
Yeah, at this point, I'm not sure I would even call it kubeconfig. I would stick to one method that we know works everywhere. That method is Kubernetes service accounts. It's no surprise that that's the one that Federation V1 used. Just because beyond that, it becomes fairly unwieldy, and I don't know how you essentially support all the methods.
Yeah, the other thing that seems a little weird to me is technically a kubeconfig file can have a list of like n clusters and n credentials. So if you have a kubeconfig file in your cluster credentials spec that has cluster endpoints that are different than the endpoints in the the actual cluster object, you have this. I'm not sure what the expected semantics of that would be. Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
Yeah, and I agree that the fact that like you can have a list of different clusters in a kubeconfig file is problematic. I would prefer, however, not to invent a new format when it seems like we're really talking about kubeconfig, like a proper subset of kubeconfig with perhaps some qualifications on the length of lists that may appear in the format.
Yeah, or if you said narrowly, it's like the user section of a kubeconfig file, like the spec or something like that. That would at least make more sense that it's clearly credentials we're talking about.
Yeah, I think I might be able to get on board with that.
And I'll add the comments I'm making to the pull requests.
Okay, that would be great. Thanks for speaking up, John.
No worries.
I just had one last thought about this kubeconfig stuff to throw out there. So at the end of the day, someone is going to put stuff in that secret. And right now we're saying it's a kubeconfig file. And then somebody is going to use that information to feed to some kind of piece of software to authenticate. And what we could do, so in the simple case, user X takes their local kubeconfig file that they know works and they stick it in the cluster. They know that with the version of the tool that they've used it with, it works. And now they can go and instead of, if they can go to a different machine, and as long as they have access to the cluster registry, they can go and pull that kubeconfig, feed it to the same version of the tool, and it should do the same thing. In a slightly different case, an administrator might say, I generate all the kubeconfigs for all the users of my cluster, and I put them in secrets in their namespaces, and I tell them to go and fetch them there and use the tool XYZ to use those to access the clusters. And that doesn't force, so putting aside the multiple credentials in a single kubeconfig file for the moment, because I think that is problematic. But forgetting about that, assuming that there was only one of those clusters in any given kubeconfig file, we could put the onus on the person creating the secret, which contains the kubeconfig, to make sure that it is conformant with whatever they plan to use this credential for. and be less prescriptive. It's sort of the opposite approach to what Christian was saying, which is bolt it down very tightly and say that it has to be this or that or the next thing. And I'm just proposing it as an alternative way of looking at the problem.
Don't you get different answers for what the admin cares about putting in there, what the user expects to get out of that resource, and what a controller would typically use from that resource?
I think you could. I can see both sides of the argument, just to be clear. And I'm not actually strongly opposed to your suggestion. I'm just thinking there is this other way of looking at it. I mean, there's a thing called a config map, and it's pretty loosey-goosey, and whoever populates that config map determines what the keys are and what information needs to be in there for a given use case for that config map to be usable. And we could take a similar approach here.
Well, if I were to build tooling at Zendesk that use this API, but if I had like almost no guarantees or constraints as to what the heck the data would look like, it's really hard to build tooling around that, or open source tooling for that matter. And kind of like that's one of the reasons I want there to be defined API objects as opposed to like config maps. Have a config map that has a JSON blob that have whatever the heck you want, but then it's entirely the onus on the operator, like the person managing things to restrict everything, and it's really hard to write tooling around that.
We're at time now, so I think we should call this conversation here and continue this. At least on GitHub. Sounds like it might be useful to have like a brainstorming session about what the right way to handle these various concerns are. But I thank everybody for participating in the discussion today. This was very useful. Thanks.
Awesome. Christian, I dropped you a quick private message there. Maybe you could have a look for that if you haven't seen it yet.
Okay, will do.
Cool.
Thanks all.
See you, everybody.